So today we're going to be talking a little bit about adequacy. Thursday this week is the test. It's also the due date for the first argument analysis. Sorry about doubling up on you. Please feel free to hand in the argument analysis early if you find it two things in one day too much. I know you're grateful for that offer. But it should be fairly straightforward. Like, I hope there's no surprises for you on the test. I think we went over last time what exactly will be on the test. So I also will post tonight, I will post a list of terms that I consider examinable terms, terms that I can ask you questions about. But really, the main bulk of it is going to be argument analysis stuff, argument diagramming stuff. So 5 of the multiple choice and an argument diagram at the end, just like you saw in the first test. So shouldn't be much surprising on this test. It should be fairly straightforward. We'll start maybe 20 minutes after the hour, so that you have 10 minutes to settle in and we can distribute the tests, and then it'll be a 1-hour test after that. So, and then you'll be free to go. There will be nothing, I think it's cruel and unusual to give people learning after a test. I want all of your energy going into the test. Okay, so, yeah?
Are you going to post the key terms for the term test 2 like you did for the test 1?
Yes, I literally just said that. Yeah, okay. But it's a good question, nonetheless. It's so good that I answered it before you asked. Okay, so any further questions about that stuff? Can I get you guys to settle down with your conversations? Great. Okay, so let's talk about adequacy. Actually, first we're going to go back to this. This stuff was on the last exercise sheet. So these are structurally similar to, I'm going to ask you, I think, at least 2 of these questions on the term test. And so they'll be in the following format. I'll give you, to what degree is this an instance of this fallacy? And then I'll give you a sentence that's supposed to be an instance or not of the fallacy. So to what degree is the following a legitimate appeal to authority? So we talked about appeal to authority last Thursday. And I told you that there were certain conditions under which it totally makes sense to appeal to somebody's authority to claim that they're right. And then there are lots of other circumstances where it doesn't make sense, where that's a fallacy, an error in reasoning. So given this sentence, and if you recall the conditions I put on that, to what degree is this sentence committing the error of appeal to authority, the fallacy of appeal to authority? Yeah. Yeah.
I'd say it is a low degree because the chief of police should know about police budgets and know whether or not they have enough money for spending in the different aspects of the
Good. So one of the things that we said an appeal to authority has to have is that the person has to have the relevant kind of authority, right? So they have to be, the authority that they have has to be related to the sort of knowledge that they're supposed to have. What were some of the other conditions, though? So that's a piece of evidence on the side of this is a legitimate appeal to authority. Is there anything on the other side of this coin? Yeah.
There's a bias to it.
Right.
So because he is the chief of police, chances are that he would want a higher budget, so he'll claim that they're sufficient.
Excellent. So one of the other conditions that we put on appeal to authority to be legitimate was that there has to be some reasonable expectation that the authority is not going to be biased. I've never known a person in authority say, no, we've got enough money, no problem. You guys, we can take a 10% cut. We got plenty of cash, don't worry about it. I've never heard somebody say that about their own budget. Probably it has happened in the history of budgets, but not often, right? People typically want more money to run their operations. This is a kind of built-in bias when anybody's evaluating the amount of money they deserve to get. Anybody evaluating the amount of money that they deserve to control has a built-in bias, right? I think that that's at least a significant factor when you're evaluating whether we should be listening to this guy about this issue. That's at least a significant factor that you should consider, right? That this person has a pretty substantial vested interest in having the answer turn out one way rather than the other. So, but that doesn't negate the first thing. This second thing does not negate the first thing that we said, which was this guy should be, doesn't gender them, but so this chief of police does legitimately have the kind of position in the world where they would have the access to the relevant knowledge. So that's a real bit of evidence that this is a legitimate appeal to authority. Also, they have a built-in bias to want more money. which is a bit of evidence that this is an illegitimate appeal to authority. So the correct answer, insofar as there is a correct answer to this, I think, is that it's somewhere in between a legitimate and illegitimate appeal to authority. And that's exactly the kind of like not black and white thinking that I really want to get you to develop with respect to these fallacies, right? Because it's not black and white, whether this is an error or totally reasonable inference. Yeah? So if you see this on the test, the ideal answer would say, well, there's some evidence on this side, there's some evidence on that side, so it lands somewhere in the middle. Okay? That's so, and I specifically chose this sentence, I wrote this sentence for you to be confused by, to be an example of it not being fully obvious that it is one or the other. Yeah? And what we're looking for is for you to have learned the conditions under which something is a legitimate appeal to authority, and to just tell me about those conditions. And tell me that, here's some evidence on this side, here's some evidence on that side. I believe this was on the exam last semester, and when we were marking it, people got full marks for either answer. So some people said this is totally legitimate, other people said it's totally illegitimate, and if they gave us a good argument, one way or the other, they got full marks. Yeah? So demonstrate your understanding of the nature of the fallacy, you get full marks. Yeah? Okay. Another one. Is this clearly an ad hominem fallacy? I don't think we should be friends anymore. You're not a very nice person. There should be a think in there. So, is this an ad hominem fallacy? To what degree and why? Yeah.
If you take the same premise that you should be friends with nice people, then it's not an ad hominem fallacy. Because it's a condition to wanting to be friends with someone is to be a good person. You're not a good person, that is not a good person.
Right. Right, exactly. So this looks more like a legitimate argument. It's not an incredibly strong argument, but it's nonetheless, well, actually, it's not a bad argument. So what we said about ad hominem fallacies was, look, if you tell somebody that they're wrong because they're a bad person, that's an ad hominem fallacy, right? You're saying your argument is invalid because you're a jerk. In this case, the conclusion of the argument is about the person's character. So them being a jerk isn't irrelevant, right? The problem with ad hominem fallacy is that you're bringing in personal characteristics of the person that you're talking with in an irrelevant way, right? It's not relevant to establishing whether the conclusion is true or false. Here, it looks pretty relevant, right? Like you want your friends to be not nice people. Sorry, you want your friends to be nice people. Therefore, it's relevant whether they are nice or not, whether you're going to be their friend, right? Presuming that you want your friends to be nice people. Maybe you want to surround yourself by devious and evil folk, but whatever your goals are. Yeah, is that fairly clear? I think this one falls much more on the side of, I think this one has a fairly clear answer, that this is not an ad hominem fallacy. Because if the subject of the argument, if the conclusion of the argument is about the person's character, then the person's character is not irrelevant. Yeah? There might be other reasons why this argument is less than perfect, but it's not an ad hominem. Okay. One more. To what extent is this begging the question, and why? So I know ghosts are real because I saw one myself. So you recall begging the question is where you use something that's supposed to be shown to show the thing that's supposed to be shown. You get a circular argument or something like that, right? Where the conclusion is assumed in the premises. So is this begging the question? Yes or no, and to what degree and why? This is another one of those, I think this is another one of those stinker questions where you could legitimately go either way. Yeah?
It's not begging the question if you can provide the evidence and you've seen one, but if your argument entirely bases on the fact that you saw seen one yourself, then it's begging the question because there's no way to prove that. You don't have proof of that.
Okay. So in this case, the claim being made is an observation claim. You say, I saw this. So I think you're on the right track there. I think you're on the right track. If you'd written that on a test, we would have given you most or all of the marks. Okay. Does anybody want further thoughts on this? Like, why and to what degree is this begging the question? Yeah.
Because even if, like you say, you saw one yourself, what proof is that actually was a ghost?
Right.
So it's still kind of like it's not a fact in the same.
Right. So good. I think this is similar to what was said before, and this is definitely on the right track. So, like, suppose the sentence before this was, you didn't really see a ghost. Ghosts aren't real. You say, I know ghosts are real. I saw one. So suppose the subject of the debate is whether you saw a ghost or not, and somebody says, well, you can't have seen one, despite what you say, because they're not real, and they come back with, well, of course they're real. I know they're real. I saw one. So, like, it seems that the conclusion has to be true for the premise to be acceptable, right? And that's a kind of begging the question. If it needs to be the case that you already accept the conclusion in order to accept the premise, then the premise doesn't by itself give you a reason to accept the conclusion. Huh? This is just facts about the basic nature of arguments, right? Like, the argument has to start from something that you can agree upon and move to something that you're trying to agree upon. Whereas in this case, it looks like you're starting from something controversial and you're moving to something equally controversial. Yeah?
But the question could very well not quite have to be that you believe in ghosts.
Right.
The person saying, I know ghosts are real. So that's all I said.
Okay, so yeah, okay, so if the original question was, do you believe in ghosts? Not like, I know ghosts aren't real. So it depends on what the conversational context is, really. I think that's exactly right. So, because remember what we said about observation reports, like, it's not a good epistemic strategy in general just to disbelieve people, right? It's not a good way of acting in the world. You're probably not going to learn a whole lot if you're just like, well, I just don't believe what people tell me because they're just people or something like that, right? So observation reports should be treated with at least some, like, credibility at minimum, even if they're somewhat extreme claims like this one. You say, well, if 9 out of 10 people say they saw a ghost, that starts to be a pretty good evidence for the existence of ghosts, right? So exactly this type of claim in the right kind of context could add up to evidence for this conclusion. So it's ambiguous, again. Yeah. Okay, is that fairly clear what's at stake here? Again, I think we accepted both yes and no answers to this, so long as you had some kind of reason. So long as you understood, demonstrate to us that you know what the fallacy is. So one sentence explaining the fallacy, one sentence relating your explanation to this specific case, and that's good for full marks typically. So long as you accurately know what the fallacy is, and so long as you sensibly connect this sentence with it in some way or other. Like, that's all we're really looking for, and the markers will be broad-minded in evaluating your answers. But the best answers are ones that show me that you understand the ambiguities of this stuff, right? Okay. If there's no other questions about that, we'll move on. Yeah?
Do we stick to one end, or do we evaluate both sides, kind of thing? That this is a fallacy and this is not a fallacy at the same time?
Feel perfectly. So the question is, do you stick to one? Do you make your argument for one side, or can you argue for both? Please feel free to argue for both sides. That often shows even better understanding of the structure of the fallacy, right? It shows me that you really can handle this stuff in a subtle and nuanced way. So that's a really good answer if you can say, well, here's some evidence on one side, here's some evidence on other, so it lands somewhere in between. That's often going to be the ideal answer. Just showing me one side, it does give me evidence that you understand the fallacy, and so it's not a bad answer, but and if you don't just default to doing both, because if it's a clear, I might throw in one that I think is a really clear example of a fallacy. Like, I think this one is a really clearly not an ad hominem fallacy. So if you tell me, it's kind of an ad hominem fallacy, that's evidence that you didn't understand what's going on, right? So yeah, there's not necessarily both sides is better, but in a case where there are two legitimate sides to the question, then yeah, that's the best answer. Yeah. Don't feel you have to stick to one or the other is the the summary of that. Okay? I bet your other classes don't do this to you. I bet your other classes don't go, well, what I want you to tell me is that there's no answer, or that it's confusing at its very nature. Its very fundamental nature is ambiguous. I bet your other classes are like, here's some facts that you can know. Isn't it great to know stuff? Okay. Am I wrong, or are there other classes that are doing this to you right now? Yeah?
Yeah, I have 2 other philosophy courses.
Okay, yeah.
and both of them.
Yeah, okay. This is probably a property of philosophy courses. So if you love people telling you that you don't know stuff, philosophy is the way to go. All right. I actually think that we do the reverse of teaching. We like unravel things that you thought you knew, right? So like you go into a philosophy class knowing a bunch of stuff and you leave knowing less stuff. It's unsurprising that they trying to shut us down. So, yeah.
That's kind of the definition of critical thinking.
It is kind of the definition of critical thinking. Like that's what we're supposed to be able to do, is to unravel beliefs that were transparent to you and be able to like unpack them and unravel them. So maybe they won't shut us down after all. Okay, so let's talk about adequacy. This is the final step in the criterial approach to evaluating arguments. I really don't have much to say about adequacy, just a couple of quick points, because it's almost everything is in acceptability and relevance, right? So if you know what acceptability is and you know what relevance is, you pretty much know how to deal with adequacy. It's just like multiplying those two things together, right? So highly acceptable, highly relevant, highly adequate. Not very acceptable, not very relevant, not very adequate. It's fairly straightforward. But it is worth asking yourself briefly, like, what makes an argument good enough? And you should immediately ask yourself, okay, good enough for what? If an argument makes it rational to increase your belief in the conclusion that it doesn't have zero adequacy, it has more than zero adequacy, at least a little bit. If an argument makes it rationally obligatory to accept the conclusion, that is, if a rational person could not help but accept the conclusion because they're rational, then it's as adequate as it can possibly be. That's kind of like a maximum level of adequacy, where you're certain of the truth of the premises, and the premises lead deductively to the conclusion. That's as adequate can possibly be, but really that's going to be the minority of arguments you're going to look at in the rest of your life, right? Almost all of the arguments you're going to look at fall somewhere between those two extremes. They're neither completely adequate nor completely inadequate. No? And in the in-between cases, you have to do this extra step in your evaluation, which is to consider the kind of significance of the conclusion. Like, what would it mean for us if the conclusion were true? Because more serious, significant conclusions require more adequate arguments to establish them. So this is my claim anyway. So in deductive proofs, adequacy can be precisely defined. That's what's so nice about deductive proofs. An argument is adequate if and only if it's deductively valid and it has true premises. The end. There's no kind of like fuzzy in-between stuff in a deductive proof. You either proved the thing or you didn't. In informal arguments, the adequacy of the argument needs to be weighed against the seriousness of the conclusion. And a little flag should go up in your head when I say seriousness, because what the hell does that mean? How do you quantify seriousness? Like, that is a very vague term that I'm using in this definition. I don't know how to cash that out in more precise terms, however. So flag that in your mind, but yeah.
You can say seriousness by, for example, like the other argument we saw in the previous class. For example, saying people shouldn't eat meat is less strong, but saying people should be, let's say, jail-free to eat, or it should be banned. And that's a stronger claim.
Right. But
it's inherently obvious the fact that one is a stronger argument than the other.
good. If it's inherently obvious, then I don't need to cash out seriousness for you. So that's good. Hopefully, in most cases, it will be obvious. I would ask you to distinguish between the strength of the conclusion and its seriousness, however. So strength, we can distinguish between most swans are white and all swans are white. And all swans are white is a much stronger conclusion, right? It makes a bigger claim, easier to refute it. If you find one black swan, you've refuted all swans are white. So it's a much stronger conclusion, but not much hangs on either of them. Right? Like, there's not a whole lot that is going to change. And if I break the news to you that there are black swans, and there are black swans, nothing changed for you. Like, you don't have to do anything about that, right? It has no practical significance for you unless your life is deeply tied up in swans for some reason. It's not a very serious conclusion for you, right? So you accept the premise, I tell you there are black swans, you're like, all right, just my saying it probably was adequate for you to accept that conclusion, because you don't have to do anything, you don't have to devote any resources, you don't have to change your lifestyle or like rally in the streets or anything. Like there's nothing that follows particularly from that conclusion. All swans are white and most swans are white are about as serious, I would say, because the consequences of accepting them are about the same, which is like not really much at all. A fun fact at dinner parties, maybe. Like I'm bad at dinner parties, aren't I? It's not a fun fact for dinner parties. Anyway, so distinguish strength from seriousness. Strength being how hard it is to prove or disprove. Seriousness being something like, how much of my life do I have to change if this thing turns out to be true? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, can something be serious if I don't personally have to do anything about it? I think it can be, yeah. So this is probably not like just what do I have to do about it, but something broader. And I really don't have a good crisp definition that would capture it all, but like maybe if somebody has to change their life or something like that. Yeah. I take it that you know seriousness when you see it. You know a conclusion that's like, oh man, geez, all right. Versus a conclusion like most swans are white. It's like, all right. So, here's a couple of examples. I see a few dark clouds on the horizon. It may rain, so I should take an umbrella. Yeah? Like the worst case scenario there, if you're wrong, is you're carrying an umbrella. I see a few dark clouds on the horizon. It may rain, so we should probably cancel the family reunion. Right? Okay, so now, like, the conclusion is substantially more serious, I claim. Right? A whole bunch of people are going to have to change their day. A whole bunch of people are going to have to do something about that conclusion if you consider it to be true. And the consequences are presumably bad. Assuming that you like your family and want to reunite with them, the consequences of that conclusion are pretty bad. They're at least serious consequences. Whereas, take your umbrella, you have an umbrella now, right? So what I'm suggesting to you is that these two arguments that just have different conclusions, I mean, one of them has a much more serious conclusion and therefore is less adequate to establish its conclusion. Yeah? This is very much in the informal side of things. Just to remind you, in a deductive proof, none of this matters. None of this. Because you either prove the thing or you didn't, right? Whereas for this stuff, you really do have to, I suggest, weight the adequacy of an argument against how important the conclusion is. Another one, I failed the test, therefore I need to rethink my priorities. That might be somewhat adequate. Versus, I failed the test, therefore I am a garbage human. That is not an adequate argument. In case you've had those exact words run through your head, that is not an adequate argument. Lots of non-garbage humans fail tests. Yeah? I promise you. So, again, the seriousness of that, I don't even know what you do about if you concluded that you're a garbage human, I don't know what you would even do about that. But it's clearly a much stronger conclusion than the first one, and it makes the argument much less adequate. It's much stronger and it's much more serious. Right? I think in this case we can say it's both stronger and more serious because probably needing to rethink your priorities is contained within the consequences of being a garbage person. So it's harder to prove and also much more serious. Yeah? Okay. So again, I said all this about formal proofs. So degree of adequacy is determined relative to how significant the conclusion is. What would accepting the conclusion mean? Yeah. I think I mentioned the debate that some physicists had in the 40s in America about whether their nuclear tests were going to ignite the atmosphere. They thought, at least one person had to do, a couple of people had to do the calculations. Say, okay, is this nuclear blast going to start a chain reaction that wipes out all of the oxygen and therefore all of the life on land? And they figured out no. They ran the numbers and they're like, nah, not going to happen. It was way out of the bounds of possibility. But whoa, boy, you better get somebody to check your numbers there, right? Like you got somebody to look over your calculations when that's the conclusion of your argument, right? Or if you're, anytime you're working with safety, like human life and all that stuff, you really want to have some pretty good arguments that are well checked. Whereas if you're doing philosophy, I don't know, like there are some consequences, just not as many. Okay. All right, so I think that's it for adequacy. Let's talk about a couple more fallacies to round this out. But that was it. I mean, that's it for the criterial approach, basically. I hope that was fairly intuitive and matches how you internally go through arguments. Again, the point of this stuff is really just to break it down into specific and explicit steps. Because when you do it all in a sort of Gestalten, holistic way, it's easy to confuse things like, do I believe these versus are they relevant? Do I hate this argument because I hate the conclusion? All that kind of stuff gets all mashed together in this quick and you should be happy that your brain does this stuff so quickly because you have to do it dozens of times a day and you don't always have time to go through all these arguments. But when it counts, it really helps to be able to slow down and do it step by step. So that was the point of doing all this stuff. All right, a couple more fallacies to round out the day. Let's do non-sequitur first. Non-sequitur, again, please don't throw Latin at people. I'm teaching you this stuff in case somebody throws it at you. This one is especially unhelpful to call the Latin name or to say does not follow because it's a really general category of fallacies. Pretty much any fallacy could be called a non sequitur fallacy because it literally just means the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And of course, any argument with a fallacy in it is like that, right? If the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. But we don't usually use it for just any problem, right? So we typically, when somebody calls something a non sequitur, what they mean is just like the conversation is taking some weird left-hand turn that you've just kind of gone off topic, yeah? So, the premises don't seem to be related in any important way to the conclusion. You have to have, it's helpful to have this as a general grab bag category because sometimes the argument is so bizarre or so weird that you can't even fit it into any of the normal kinds of error. Like to be able to actually identify the kind of error that you're making, you have to make some sense. And if you make no sense, you can at least call it a non sequitur. Here's one from Hamlet. If you call me Jephthah, my lord, I have a daughter that I love passing well. Hamlet, nay, that follows not. It's just that the first thing he said really was just unrelated. It's a conditional, so Polonius is giving a conditional. If my name is this, then I have a lovely daughter. And Hamlet says, those things aren't related at all, are they? Right? It's just a non sequitur. Guys, do you mind being a little more quiet? Thank you. I can hear you from here. Yeah. All right. Here's another one. People generally like to walk on the beach. Beaches have sand, therefore having sand in homes would be a great idea. Right? Okay, so it's helpful to tease out why this is a non sequitur. Why is it that the subject of the premises is different from the subject of the conclusion? Yeah.
The argument is invalid.
Yes, that is correct. That is absolutely true. But why are the premises unrelated to the conclusion? In what specific sense? Yeah.
Well, they assume that the reason people like walking on the beaches is because of sand.
Good. Yeah. So this argument's started from the idea, well, yeah, beaches have sand, and therefore having sand on the homes would be a great idea. It's the assumption is that the thing that people like walking on beaches is the fact that there's sand, and furthermore that would transfer this, so that anywhere that there is sand, people would be having a good time, something like that. I don't know. It's not too important. I don't think I'm going to test you on non sequitur because it's so general, so non-specific that like they're all non sequiturs, really. Like any fallacy is really a non sequitur. So, and yeah, like as with all fallacies, telling somebody they've committed a non sequitur is pretty unlikely to move the conversation forward. This is doubly true for these really general categories because you haven't told, if you tell somebody they've committed a non sequitur, you haven't even told them what kind of error they've made. You've just told them it could be a deductively invalid argument, it could be an inductively invalid argument, it could be any of these kind of fallacies that we talked about. So this is the cream of the crop of snooty ways of engaging people in conversation. If somebody throws this term non sequitur at you and doesn't explain why it's a non sequitur, tell them that I said that. That will be a nice appeal to authority that you can make. All right. Here's one that's more specific. Slippery slope fallacy. And this was included, I think it was mentioned in one of the arguments we analyzed, the claim that there would be a slippery slope. So this should be, I hope that you've heard of this before anyway, but like let's do it in detail. So they're based on questionable conditionals, series of if-then statements. So if this happens, then that'll happen. If that happens, then the other thing will happen. And of course, as with all of these, there are legitimately slippery slopes, right? The slippery slope fallacy is when you say there is a slippery slope and there isn't one. Whereas there are some actually slippery slopes in life where one thing leads to another, and you're going downhill in some bad way, right? So pointing that out is not an error of reasoning. It's when you claim that there's such a thing and there ain't. So here's Ben Carson. This is like the classic example of a slippery slope. I think it's the liberal bias of like logic textbooks that makes this the classic example. So, but let me preface this by saying that there is a serious debate about whether this is a slippery slope or not. Right? So this is definitely one of those ambiguous ones. So if you change the definition, this is Ben Carson, and if you change the definition of marriage for one group, what defense do you have for the next group that comes along and wants it changed? The Republican presidential candidate asked radio host Eric Metaxas on Thursday. Can you say, oh no, we're just changing it for one group and it'll be this way forever? How is that fair? It just doesn't make sense. If you change the definition for one group, what defense do you have for the next group that comes along and wants it changed? So the standard objection for decades to gay marriage that looked like it was going to hold the fight, actually. For like most of my life, everybody was sure that there would be no gay marriage and no legal pot. The last decade has been very interesting for those issues. But the argument against gay marriage, the standard argument against gay marriage is, well, if you let gay people get married, then you're going to have like polygamous marriages where one guy is married to 10 women, and then you're going to have people marrying their dogs, and then you're going to have people marrying lampposts, and there's no end to it, right? If you go anything but traditional marriage, it just goes on and on and on. So that was the standard argument, and smug logic professors have been using it as a standard example of a slippery slope fallacy that whole time. So what do you think, without revealing too much about your political reviews, do you think this is a slippery slope argument or not? And by the way, keep in mind that calling this a slippery slope argument is not an endorsement of gay marriage, right? So you can reject the argument without rejecting the conclusion that he's come to. But do you think this is a slippery slope argument or a slippery slope fallacy or not? Yeah.
Also, it's weird calling homosexuals a group of people.
Is it? I guess it's not like they all have each other's contact info or anything, but it's an identity group. Okay, but on the specific question of is this a slippery slope fallacy or isn't it? Right. So what would make it a slippery slope fallacy is if he's suggesting that one thing will lead to another thing will lead to another thing, and that it's not necessarily true that that sequence of events will happen. Right. So it's about the strength of the conditionals here. So if-then statements tell you if you get this, then you'll get that. And he's made a couple of conditional statements, and it's really about whether you believe those conditionals. Yeah? Yeah.
I almost want to say it's an argument because basically if you change the definition of something, then yeah, like it can always change because like if someone is saying, you know, I have a right to love who I love,
Mm-hmm.
why can't I have a right to love what I love?
Right.
Even if it's a dog, but
Right. So you do open questions like that. By changing the definition of marriage, you do open up questions like that. So I think that part of the argument is actually pretty good. But the response is, of course, well, you know, if you ask why can't I marry my dog, the answer is, well, your dog's not a person. Your dog can't give consent, for example. It can't give informed consent, right? Your dog can't agree to legal contracts. Marriage is a legal contract, and your dog can't agree to legal contracts. So those are all reasons, like even once the ball is rolling and we're asking ourselves, okay, what should marriage be really? There are, I mean, this is the standard response from the left, or supporters of gay marriage. Well, you're not going to be allowed to marry your dog because your dog's not a person. Gay people are people. It's right in the name, gay people. So, like, that's the difference, right? So that's where the slope stops being slippery, and we start to get into, no, there are real reasons why this would not continue on a slippery slope. So that's the response. That's the response from the, and there are responses to that response and responses to those responses and so on and so forth. So we're not gonna solve this one today. All I want you to see is what would make this a fallacy and what would make this a reasonable argument. And what would make it a fallacy is if you're saying this will lead to that, when there's not actually something that would stop it from going there. And it would be a reasonable argument if there is nothing stopping it, right? I mean, like, what actually is the argument against being married to multiple people? So what I gave you just then was an argument against marrying dogs. Is there a good argument against marrying more than one person? A lot of countries is allowed. Actually, that's the traditional definition of marriage. If you go to the Bible and like look at their definition of marriage, it's pretty wide open in terms of having multiple wives at least. They're less hyped on multiple husbands, but that also exists in a bunch of cultures around the world. So you know, that part of the argument, I don't actually see why that part of the argument is wrong. So if you say there's a slippery slope from allowing gay marriage to allowing people to have multiple partners, yeah, there might be. So that bit of the argument is it a legitimate slippery slope, not a slippery slope fallacy. Yeah? It's when you get to marrying dogs and lampposts that I think there start to be like actual reasons why no. Like even though we're opening up these questions, they're not that open, right? Okay. Here's one that's been on my mind lately. If you don't confront fascism early, it can grow out of control and overthrow democracy. That's not a, well, hang on. Is it a legitimate argument or is it a slippery slope fallacy? It's a legitimate argument. Okay, yeah. I'm worried that it is a legitimate argument. But why? Why?
I mean, if we rephrase this, if you don't stop violence, it's going to grow and grow. And I don't think that can be debated. And fascism, by definition, will include violence.
Okay, yeah, I guess so. Like both of my grandfathers did substantial violence in the name of stopping fascism. One of them dropped bombs out of a bomber plane and the other invaded Sicily. So like they did quite a bit of violence, way more violence than I'll ever do in my life was committed by my grandfathers in order to stop fascism. So I'm not sure putting it just down to violence is the right issue here. But yeah.
Well, just the fact that it's saying it can grow is not saying that it's a definite scenario.
Good.
Would be a slippery slope fallacy.
Good. So this is a really key thing to keep in mind. So you can say, if you allow fascists to exist in your society, then definitely fascism will take over. That's probably a slippery slope, right? Because there's been lots of societies with totalitarian elements that didn't end up totalitarian. So the strength of your inference also matters quite a lot here. So if you say, if you allow, we can go back to the last one, if you allow gay marriage, then people will definitely be allowed to marry lampposts. That's probably a slippery slope. If you say, this will throw some things into question, and it becomes possible that the society will go out of bounds that we find acceptable, it's a much weaker claim, like you're claiming much, much less, and therefore it's much easier to provide a legitimate argument for that conclusion. Right? So whether your slope is slippery depends on the conclusion that you're aiming at. You cannot keep buying Magic the Gathering cards with all your spare money. You're ruining your life. That's just a great argument. That's just a fantastic argument. There's no error there at all. Yeah.
If it's spare money, then he wouldn't be.
Okay, good. No, it's playing Magic the Gathering that's the problem. It's not the money. That's the issue. All right. Okay, that was just to leaven the grimness a little bit. I had one last semester. I had one in here about credit card debt, and I got to the end. I was like, oh man, I'm depressing myself. All right, so the point is, some slopes are genuinely slippery, right? Sometimes x really does lead to y, really does lead to z, and pointing that out is a perfectly legitimate thing to do in an argument. But sometimes it isn't, and there's a lot of middle ground between those two, right? There's a lot of gray area between saying this is a totally legitimate set of conditionals, and this is a slippery slope fallacy. Yeah? Okay, running out of time, so let's move on. A couple causal fallacies. These are fallacies about attributing causation. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after the fact, therefore because of the fact. So it's clearly not the case that, I'm going to do these pretty quick because I think that they'll just be obvious, and I'm more or less just telling you the name for this thing that you already knew. So it's clearly not the case that if one thing precedes another, then it is the cause, right? The light turning yellow did not cause the light to turn red. It's some mechanism in the thing that caused both of those things, right? Just something preceding another thing isn't enough to conclude that the first thing was the cause of the second thing. Yeah? Okay, so the yellow light caused the red light to shine. I wore this sweater the day my team won the championship, so it's my lucky sweater. Right? They're just saying, first one thing happened, and then another thing happened, therefore there was a causal connection between those things. Not a good argument. You would need to do like some kind of Excel spreadsheet where you figured out how often your team won versus when you were wearing it versus when you weren't wearing it. Like you'd need to build up some kind of case rather than just saying, well, one thing happened, then another thing happened, therefore. Right? Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Fairly straightforward? Yeah, good. So on the assumption that causes must precede their effects, x coming before y is a necessary condition for x causing y. So being one thing preceding another is not irrelevant to building causal attributions, right? But is just one condition. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. I'm sorry to tell you that philosophers still disagree on what you actually need to have in place to call something a cause. Scientists too, by the way, not just philosophers. So one promising approach is Woodward's interventionism, which says something like, to say x causes y is to say that you can, if you wiggle x, y will wiggle. Or if you want to change what happens with x, you can do so by changing y, or the other way around. Yeah. If you can change one thing and have it cause a change in the other, then that's a cause. Right. Not important, not going to be on the test. It is incredibly important. I did most of my thesis on it, but it's not going to be on the test. So, okay, here's another one, spurious correlation. So finding a correlation is not sufficient to say that two things are importantly related by a cause. Sometimes correlations show up randomly. So here's a lovely graph of global average temperature versus the number of Caribbean pirates. And as you can see, there's a steady correlation between rising global temperatures and falling Caribbean piracy. Therefore, nothing. Therefore, nothing. That's not a, they are correlated. You can see, actually, this graph is really weird, actually. So it goes by, you know, the x-axis goes 3,500, 4,500, 2,000, 1,500, 5,000, 400, 17. What? Anyway, so the correlation is not as neat as this bizarrely constructed graph makes it look, but there is nonetheless a correlation between rising global temperatures and declining Caribbean sea piracy. So are the two causally related? No, not that I know of. There might be some complex third cause underwriting both, like global industrialization or something like that. But that doesn't mean, just because these two things are correlated, certainly does not mean that there's a cause. Okay. And common cause, so two things can be systematically related, but one is not necessarily the cause of another. So sometimes they can have a common cause. Anytime I start to get a cough, my nose is also stuffed up, so coughing must cause my sinuses to be blocked. Right? Just common cause. There's a third thing that's causing both of those things, so it causes them to be correlated without one thing causing the other. Yeah? I take it that you should look at this and go, yeah, obviously. Right. So just a couple of points on causal fallacies in general. X happening before Y is a necessary condition to infer causation, but not a sufficient one. You need this to be true, but it being true is not enough to conclude that you've got a cause. X being correlated with Y is a necessary condition for X being a cause of Y. Like if two variables are just totally unrelated in whether they happen or not, it's very unlikely that one is a cause of the other. So you need them to be correlated, but again, it's not sufficient. To attribute causation, you need to be able to intervene on one and thereby bring about a change in the other. That's really the quickest way I could summarize when it's legitimate to attribute causality. It's when you can intervene on one thing and have it end up as effects in the other. So you can control the second thing by controlling the first thing. Okay. That's it for today. Thanks, everyone.